In the basement archives of the University of Edinburgh, there's a photograph that has been sealed away for nearly 2 decades. Taken in 1905 during an expedition to document ancient Celtic ruins in the Scottish Highlands, it shows a team of archaeologists examining stone carvings beside a still mountain lake. But when digital enhancement technology was applied to the image in 2004, researchers discovered something in the water's reflection that made them immediately classify the photograph as restricted access. Something that shouldn't exist, captured in perfect clarity, staring back at them from across more than a century of time. This is the story of the Loch Droidhecht expedition photograph, and the discovery that forced an entire university department to question everything they thought they knew about history, reality, and the things that watch us from the spaces between worlds. Our investigation begins in the autumn of 2023, when Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, a specialist in historical photographic analysis, was granted unprecedented access to the University of Edinburgh's restricted archives. Dr. Mackenzie had spent her career developing techniques for extracting hidden information from historical images, and her work had revolutionized the field of archaeological documentation. Dr. Mackenzie had built her reputation on her ability to reveal details in ancient photographs that had been invisible to previous generations of researchers. Her techniques combined traditional photographic analysis with cutting-edge digital enhancement methods, allowing her to peer deeper into historical images than anyone had thought possible. The techniques she had pioneered involved using multiple scanning methods and advanced computer algorithms to enhance and clarify historical images. Her software could analyze the chemical composition of photographic emulsions, compensate for age-related deterioration, and even reconstruct missing portions of images based on mathematical models. Dr. Mackenzie's laboratory was equipped with state-of-the-art scanning equipment that could capture images at resolutions far exceeding what was possible with conventional photography. Her custom-built scanners used multiple light sources and specialized filters to reveal details that were invisible to the naked eye. The process of digital restoration required not only technical skill, but also extensive knowledge of historical photographic techniques. Dr. Mackenzie had studied the methods used by photographers throughout history, understanding how different chemicals, papers, and processes affected the final images. Her work had been featured in numerous academic journals and had contributed to important historical research projects around the world. Museums and archives regularly sought her expertise when dealing with their most challenging preservation cases. Her most famous previous case had involved enhancing a Civil War photograph that had revealed the presence of a previously unknown regiment, leading to the discovery of military records that had been lost for over a century. That success had established her reputation as someone who could find the impossible in historical images. Dr. Mackenzie had also worked on several cases involving allegedly supernatural photographs, applying rigorous scientific methods to distinguish genuine anomalies from hoaxes or natural phenomena. Her expertise in both technical analysis and historical context made her uniquely qualified to investigate unusual photographic evidence. The University of Edinburgh had contacted Dr. Mackenzie specifically to examine a collection of photographs from early 20th century archaeological expeditions that had been stored in their archives for decades. The university was planning a major exhibition on Scottish archaeological history, and they wanted to ensure that all available information had been extracted from their photographic collection. The collection included images from dozens of expeditions conducted between 1900 and 1920, documenting the discovery and study of ancient sites throughout Scotland. These expeditions had been led by some of the most prominent archaeologists of their time, and their work had contributed significantly to the understanding of Celtic and pre-Celtic cultures in Scotland. The University of Edinburgh had been at the forefront of archaeological research during the early 20th century, with its faculty conducting groundbreaking studies of ancient Scottish sites. The photographic collection represented a comprehensive visual record of this important period in archaeological history. Dr. Mackenzie had been working through the collection systematically, applying her enhancement techniques to each photograph and creating detailed digital archives that revealed previously unknown details about the archaeological sites and the expeditions that had studied them. Most of the photographs were straightforward documentation of archaeological work, teams of researchers examining stone circles, burial chambers, and other ancient structures. The images provided valuable insight into early 20th century archaeological methods and had revealed several previously unknown details about the sites that had been studied. The enhancement process had already yielded significant discoveries, including the identification of previously unknown stone carvings and the revelation of construction techniques that had been invisible in the original photographs. Dr. Mackenzie's work was providing new insights into ancient Scottish cultures and their sophisticated understanding of engineering and astronomy. But it was when Dr. Mackenzie reached the photographs from the 1905 Loch Draoidheacht expedition that her work took an unexpected and disturbing turn. The expedition had been led by Professor Alistair Blackwood, a renowned Celtic scholar who had spent his career studying the ancient cultures of the Scottish Highlands. Professor Blackwood had been particularly interested in sites that showed evidence of pre-Christian religious practices, and he had organized the Loch Draoidheacht expedition to investigate reports of unusual stone carvings that had been discovered near a remote highland lake. Professor Blackwood had been considered one of the leading experts on Celtic culture and religion, with a particular focus on the transition period between pre-Christian and Christian practices in Scotland. His work had contributed significantly to the understanding of how ancient Celtic beliefs had evolved and adapted over time. Loch Draoidheacht, whose name roughly translated to Lake of Sorcery in Gaelic, was located in one of the most isolated regions of the Scottish Highlands. The lake was surrounded by steep mountains and was accessible only by a difficult hiking trail that took several days to traverse. The remoteness of the location had kept it largely unexplored until Professor Blackwood's expedition. The lake itself was unusual in several respects. It was much deeper than other highland lakes of similar size, with some areas reaching depths that had never been accurately measured. The water was unusually clear and still, creating perfect mirror-like reflections even in windy conditions. Local folklore claimed that the lake never froze, even during the harshest highland winters. The expedition team had consisted of 6 researchers: Professor Blackwood himself, 2 graduate students named Thomas Sinclair and William Morrison, a photographer named James Morrison, who was William's older brother, and 2 local guides named Hamish MacLeod and Duncan Campbell, who were familiar with the highland terrain. They had planned to spend 2 weeks at the site, documenting the stone carvings and conducting preliminary excavations. The team had been carefully selected for their expertise and experience with challenging field conditions. Professor Blackwood had insisted on bringing only researchers who had proven themselves capable of working in remote and difficult environments, as he had anticipated that the expedition would face significant logistical challenges. The stone carvings that had drawn Professor Blackwood's attention were unlike anything that had been found at other Celtic sites. They depicted strange symbols and figures that didn't match known Celtic artistic traditions, and they appeared to be much older than typical Celtic artifacts. Some of the carvings showed human-like figures with elongated limbs and unusual facial features, while others depicted geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the viewing angle. The carvings had been discovered by a shepherd named Angus MacBride, who had been searching for lost sheep in the area around the lake. MacBride had reported the discovery to the local parish priest, who had in turn contacted the University of Edinburgh. The priest had been disturbed by the carvings and had urged the university to investigate them as quickly as possible. Professor Blackwood had been intrigued by the priest's description of the carvings and had organized the expedition within weeks of receiving the report. He had believed that the carvings might represent evidence of pre-Celtic peoples who had inhabited the highlands, thousands of years before the arrival of the Celts. Dr. Mackenzie began her analysis with the expedition's documentation photographs, which showed the team's arrival at the site and their initial examination of the stone carvings. These images were typical of archaeological photography from the period, showing the researchers at work and providing clear documentation of the artifacts they were studying. The photographs showed that the expedition had been well equipped and professionally organized, with proper documentation procedures and careful attention to archaeological methodology. Professor Blackwood had clearly been committed to conducting a thorough and scientific investigation of the site, but as Dr. Mackenzie applied her enhancement techniques to the photographs, She began to notice unusual details that hadn't been visible in the original images. The stone carvings appeared to be more extensive than had been previously documented, with additional symbols and figures becoming visible under digital enhancement. The enhanced images revealed that the carvings formed complex patterns that extended far beyond what had been visible to the original expedition. The symbols seemed to be arranged in specific configurations that suggested they might have astronomical or mathematical significance. More intriguingly, some of the enhanced images showed what appeared to be additional structures in the background that hadn't been mentioned in the expedition's written reports. These structures seemed to be partially hidden by vegetation and natural rock formations, but they clearly showed signs of human construction. The hidden structures appeared to be much older than the stone carvings, suggesting that the site had been occupied by multiple cultures over thousands of years. The discovery of these structures had significant implications for understanding the history of human settlement in the Scottish Highlands. Dr. Mackenzie was particularly interested in a series of photographs that had been taken beside the lake itself. These images showed the expedition team examining stone carvings that were located on a large boulder that sat partially in the water. The boulder was covered with intricate carvings that appeared to extend below the waterline, suggesting that the lake level had risen since the carvings were created. The photographs of the lakeside carvings were technically excellent, showing clear detail of both the stone carvings and the surrounding landscape. The photographer, James Morrison, had been skilled in the challenging techniques required for outdoor photography in 1905, and his images provided exceptional documentation of the site. James Morrison had been considered one of the finest archaeological photographers of his generation, with a particular talent for capturing the subtle details of ancient artifacts. His work had been featured in numerous academic publications and had contributed significantly to the documentation of archaeological discoveries throughout Scotland. It was while enhancing one of these lakeside photographs that Dr. Mackenzie made the discovery that would change everything. The photograph showed Professor Blackwood and two of his colleagues examining the carved boulder, with the still surface of the lake visible in the background. The water was perfectly calm, creating a mirror-like reflection of the sky, the surrounding mountains and the researchers themselves. The composition of the photograph was masterful, with the reflection in the water creating a sense of symmetry and depth that enhanced the visual impact of the image. The lighting was perfect, with the soft Highland sun illuminating both the stone carvings and the faces of the researchers. Dr. Mackenzie had been using her enhancement software to bring out details in the stone carvings when she noticed something unusual about the reflection in the water. At first, she thought it might be a flaw in the photographic plate, or perhaps some debris floating on the lake's surface. But as she applied more sophisticated enhancement techniques, the anomaly in the reflection became clearer and more disturbing. There, reflected in the still water of the lake, was a face that belonged to no one in the photograph. The face was human in general appearance, but there was something fundamentally wrong about its proportions and features. The eyes were too large and too dark, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The facial structure was elongated in a way that suggested something that was almost human, but not quite, as if it were a distorted reflection of humanity itself. The features of the face were both familiar and alien, suggesting a being that had evolved along similar lines to humans, but had developed in isolation for thousands of years. The skin appeared pale and translucent, with a quality that suggested it rarely saw sunlight. Most disturbing was the expression on the face. While the expedition members in the photograph appeared focused on their work, the face in the reflection was staring directly at the camera with an intensity that was almost palpable. The eyes seemed to follow Dr. Mackenzie as she moved around her computer screen, creating an unsettling sense that she was being watched across more than a century of time. The direct gaze of the entity in the reflection suggested a level of intelligence and awareness that was deeply unsettling. It was clear that whatever had been captured in the photograph was not simply a passive presence, but an active observer that was fully aware of being photographed. Dr. Mackenzie initially assumed that the anomaly was the result of some kind of photographic error, or perhaps damage to the original glass plate negative. But as she examined the image more closely, she realized that the face in the reflection was too clear and too detailed to be explained by conventional photographic phenomena. The reflection showed proper perspective and lighting that would be consistent with an actual person standing near the lake. But when Dr. Mackenzie examined the main portion of the photograph, there was no one in the corresponding position. The face appeared to be reflected from a location where no one was standing. The technical accuracy of the reflection ruled out most conventional explanations for the anomaly. The perspective, lighting, and positioning were all correct for a real reflection, suggesting that something had actually been present at the lake during the photography session. Dr. Mackenzie applied every enhancement technique in her arsenal to the photograph, hoping to find some explanation for the anomaly. She examined the image at the molecular level, analyzing the distribution of silver particles in the photographic emulsion to determine whether the face had been added through double exposure or other manipulation. But every test confirmed that the face in the reflection was an integral part of the original photograph, captured at the same time as the rest of the image. There was no evidence of tampering, manipulation, or photographic error that could account for the presence of the mysterious face. The chemical analysis of the photographic plate showed that the silver particles forming the image of the face had been deposited during the original exposure, ruling out any possibility of later manipulation or addition. The face had definitely been captured by the camera in 1905. Dr. Mackenzie decided to research the history of the 1905 expedition to see if there might be any explanation for what she had discovered. She began by examining the expedition's official reports and the personal journals of the team members, looking for any mention of unusual experiences or unexplained phenomena. The expedition's official report, filed with the University of Edinburgh upon the team's return, was a straightforward account of their archaeological work. Professor Blackwood had documented the stone carvings in detail and had proposed several theories about their origin and significance. The report made no mention of any unusual experiences or supernatural encounters. The official report described the expedition as a complete success, with significant archaeological discoveries that would contribute to the understanding of ancient Scottish cultures. Professor Blackwood had recommended that additional expeditions be organized to continue the study of the site, but Dr. Mackenzie's research led her to discover that there were significant gaps in the expedition's documentation. Several days' worth of journal entries were missing from Professor Blackwood's personal records, and the expedition's photographer, James Morrison, had apparently destroyed many of his photographs shortly after returning from the Highlands. The missing documentation suggested that something significant had happened during the expedition that the team had chosen not to include in their official reports. The destruction of photographs was particularly suspicious, as James Morrison had been known for his meticulous preservation of his work. More intriguingly, Dr. Mackenzie found evidence that the expedition had been cut short. The team had originally planned to spend 2 weeks at Loch Droidheacht, but they had returned to Edinburgh after only 8 days, citing unexpected difficulties that were never fully explained. The early return from the expedition was highly unusual for Professor Blackwood, who was known for his thorough and methodical approach to archaeological research. He had never before abandoned an expedition without completing his planned research objectives. Dr. Mackenzie decided to investigate what had happened to the expedition members after their return from Loch Droidheacht. What she discovered was a pattern of tragedy and misfortune that seemed to follow everyone who had been present at the lake. Professor Blackwood had died less than a year after the expedition, reportedly from a sudden illness that had baffled his physicians. His colleagues had described a dramatic change in his personality following his return from the Highlands, noting that he had become withdrawn and obsessed with subjects that were far removed from his usual academic interests. The illness that had claimed Professor Blackwood's life had been unlike anything his physicians had encountered. He had suffered from severe insomnia, claiming that he was afraid to close his eyes because of the visions that plagued his dreams. He had also developed an intense fear of water, refusing to bathe or even drink from glasses that reflected his image. James Morrison, the expedition photographer, had suffered a complete mental breakdown within months of returning from Loch Droidheacht. He had been committed to an asylum, where he had spent his remaining years creating disturbing artwork that depicted elongated humanoid figures emerging from bodies of water. Morrison's artwork had been preserved in the asylum's records, and Dr. Mackenzie was able to examine examples of his post-expedition creations. The drawings and paintings showed remarkable consistency in their depiction of aquatic entities, suggesting that Morrison had been drawing from specific memories or visions rather than general madness. The two graduate students who had participated in the expedition had both left their academic careers shortly after returning from the Highlands. Thomas Sinclair had emigrated to Australia and had never been heard from again, while William Morrison had become a recluse who refused to discuss his experiences at Loch Droid Hecht. William Morrison had inherited a small estate in the Scottish borders, where he had lived alone for the rest of his life. Neighbours had reported that he had covered all the mirrors in his house and had refused to go near any body of water, including the small stream that ran through his property. Even the local guides who had led the expedition to the lake had been affected. Hamish MacLeod had died in a drowning accident less than 2 years after the expedition, found floating in a shallow stream that he had crossed safely hundreds of times before. Duncan Campbell had survived longer, but had become known throughout the Highlands for his warnings about Loch Droid Hecht, urging anyone who would listen to avoid the area entirely. The pattern of tragedy and misfortune that had befallen the expedition members suggested that something significant had happened at Loch Droid Hecht, something that had been carefully concealed from the official records. Dr. Mackenzie decided to research the history of Loch Droid Hecht itself, hoping to find some explanation for the mysterious face in the reflection and the fate of the expedition members. Her research revealed that the lake had a long history of supernatural associations in local folklore. For centuries, the people of the surrounding highlands had told stories about strange creatures that lived in the lake's depths and about people who had disappeared after venturing too close to the water. The folklore surrounding Loch Droid Hecht was extensive and consistent across multiple generations, suggesting that the stories were based on real experiences rather than simple superstition. The tales had been passed down through oral tradition for hundreds of years before being recorded by folklorists in the 19th century. The lake's name, Loch Droid Hecht, was itself significant. In ancient Gaelic, the word Droid Hecht referred to druidic magic and supernatural powers. The lake had apparently been considered a sacred site by pre-Christian Celtic peoples who had believed that it was a gateway between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. The Celtic Druids had considered certain bodies of water to be sacred portals where the boundaries between different worlds were thin. Loch Droid Hecht had been one of the most important of these sites, with Druids travelling from across Scotland to conduct rituals and ceremonies at the lake. Local legends spoke of beings called the Sluag Uisge, or water spirits that were said to inhabit the lake. These entities were described as appearing almost human, but with features that were subtly wrong, as if they were imperfect copies of human beings. The legends claimed that the Sluag Uisge could appear in reflections and mirrors, watching the living world from their watery realm. The descriptions of the Sluag Uisge in local folklore were remarkably consistent with the face that Dr. E. Mackenzie had discovered in the 1905 photograph. The elongated features, the two large eyes, and the unsettling gaze were all elements that appeared repeatedly in the traditional stories. Most disturbing were the stories about people who had seen their own reflections in the lake's waters, only to discover that the reflection was looking back at them with eyes that were not their own. According to local folklore, anyone who made eye contact with one of the Sluag Uisge would be marked for a terrible fate. The folklore also described specific rituals and precautions that could be taken to protect oneself from the water spirits. These included avoiding looking directly into the lake's surface, carrying certain protective charms, and performing specific ceremonies before approaching the water. Dr. Mackenzie realized that the face in the 1905 photograph might be connected to these ancient legends, but she needed more evidence before she could draw any definitive conclusions. Dr. Mackenzie decided to examine the other photographs from the Loch Droid Hecht expedition to see if similar anomalies appeared in any other images. She applied her enhancement techniques to every photograph in the collection, looking for any sign of the mysterious face or other unexplained phenomena. In several of the photographs, she found subtle anomalies that became more apparent under digital enhancement. Shadows that didn't correspond to any visible objects, areas of water that seemed to show movement despite the lake's apparently calm surface, and strange distortions in reflections that suggested the presence of something that wasn't visible in the main portion of the images. The anomalies appeared in photographs taken at different times of day and from different angles. suggesting that whatever was causing them was consistently present at the lake throughout the expedition's stay. Most significantly, Dr. Mackenzie discovered that the mysterious face appeared in multiple photographs, always in reflections and always staring directly at the camera. The face seemed to be following the expedition's movements around the lake, appearing in different locations, but always maintaining that same unsettling, direct gaze. The consistency of the face's appearance across multiple photographs ruled out the possibility of simple photographic errors or damage to individual plates. Something had been present at Loch Droidhecht in 1905, something that had been captured by the camera but had apparently been invisible to the human eye. The face appeared in at least 7 different photographs from the expedition, always in water reflections, but sometimes also in other reflective surfaces, such as wet rocks or metal equipment. The entity seemed to be using any available reflective surface to observe the expedition members. Dr. Mackenzie also noticed that the expedition members' behavior seemed to change over the course of the photographs. In the early images, the team appeared confident and focused on their work. But in the later photographs, their body language suggested increasing tension and unease. Professor Blackwood, in particular, seemed to become more agitated as the expedition progressed. In the final photographs, he appeared to be avoiding looking directly at the lake, and his posture suggested someone who was deeply troubled by something he had experienced. The graduate students also showed signs of increasing stress in the later photographs, with both Thomas Sinclair and William Morrison appearing nervous and distracted. James Morrison, the photographer, seemed to be having difficulty with his equipment, as evidenced by several blurred or poorly composed images that were uncharacteristic of his usual work. Dr. Mackenzie decided to contact other experts in historical photography and paranormal research to get their opinions on her discoveries. She reached out to Dr. Robert Sinclair, a professor of Celtic studies at the University of Glasgow, and Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher who specialized in anomalous photographic phenomena. Dr. Sinclair was fascinated by the connection between Dr. Mackenzie's discoveries and the ancient folklore of the Scottish Highlands. He had spent years studying Celtic beliefs about water spirits and other worldly entities, and he was familiar with the legends surrounding Loch Droidhecht. The Sluag Wiske were believed to be ancient beings that existed in a realm parallel to our own, Dr. Sinclair explained. According to Celtic tradition, they could observe our world through reflective surfaces, particularly bodies of water. The legends suggest that they were curious about human beings, but that contact with them was dangerous for mortals. Dr. Sinclair had written extensively about the role of water in Celtic mythology and religion, and he was considered one of the leading experts on the subject. His research had revealed that water spirits were a common element in Celtic folklore throughout Europe, suggesting that the beliefs might have been based on real encounters with unknown entities. Dr. Sinclair also provided historical context for the stone carvings that had drawn Professor Blackwood's expedition to the lake. He believed that the carvings were much older than typical Celtic artifacts and might represent evidence of pre-Celtic peoples who had inhabited the highlands thousands of years ago. These ancient peoples may have had knowledge of the Sluag Wiske that was later incorporated into Celtic folklore, Dr. Sinclair suggested. The stone carvings could be warnings or instructions related to the entities that inhabit the lake. The stone carvings around Loch Droidhecht were unique in several respects, showing artistic techniques and symbolic elements that didn't appear at other ancient sites in Scotland. Dr. Sinclair believed that they might represent the work of a previously unknown culture that had possessed advanced knowledge of the supernatural entities in the lake. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of the photographic anomalies was equally intriguing. She had studied hundreds of allegedly supernatural photographs and had developed techniques for distinguishing genuine anomalies from hoaxes or natural phenomena. The consistency and clarity of the face across multiple photographs is remarkable, Dr. Vasquez observed. The technical characteristics of the anomaly suggest that we're dealing with something that was actually present at the location, rather than a photographic artifact or manipulation. Dr. Vasquez had developed a classification system for supernatural photographs based on the technical characteristics of the anomalies they contained. The Loch Droidhecht photographs fit the profile of what she called Class A supernatural photography, images that showed clear, detailed manifestations that appeared to be interacting with their environment in realistic ways. Dr. Vasquez also noted that the direct gaze of the face in the reflections was significant from a paranormal perspective. In many documented cases of supernatural photography, entities that appear in images seem to be aware of the camera and often appear to be looking directly at the photographer. This suggests a level of intelligence and awareness that goes beyond simple residual energy. The expert analysis confirmed that Dr. Mackenzie's discoveries were significant and worthy of further investigation. The combination of historical context, folklore, and technical analysis provided strong evidence that the 1905 expedition had encountered something genuinely supernatural at Loch Droid Hecht. Armed with expert confirmation that her discoveries were significant, Dr. Mackenzie decided to investigate what had happened to Loch Droid Hecht in the years following the 1905 expedition. Her research revealed that the lake had been largely avoided by researchers and visitors for decades after Professor Blackwood's expedition. The University of Edinburgh had apparently classified the site as unsuitable for further study, and no official expeditions had been organized to return to the area. The university's decision to avoid the site was highly unusual, as Loch Droid Hecht contained some of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Scotland. The fact that such an important site had been abandoned suggested that the university was aware of dangers that weren't mentioned in the official records. However, Dr. Mackenzie found evidence of several unofficial visits to the lake over the years, and many of these visits had ended in tragedy or mysterious circumstances. In 1923, a group of hikers had disappeared while camping near Loch Droid Hecht. Their bodies were never found, but their abandoned campsite showed signs of a hasty departure, with personal belongings scattered around the area as if the campers had fled in panic. The search for the missing hikers had been extensive, involving local police and volunteer search teams, but despite covering the entire area around the lake, no trace of the hikers had ever been found. The search teams had reported feeling uneasy while working near the lake, with several volunteers refusing to continue the search after experiencing what they described as an overwhelming sense of being watched. In 1947, a team of geologists had attempted to study the lake's unusual mineral composition. The expedition had been abandoned after only 2 days when several team members reported seeing figures moving beneath the water's surface. The geologists had refused to discuss their experiences publicly, but private correspondence suggested that they had encountered something that had terrified them. The geological expedition had been organized by the British Geological Survey, which had been interested in the unusual mineral deposits around the lake. The team had been equipped with sophisticated scientific instruments, but their equipment had malfunctioned repeatedly during their brief stay at the site. More recently, in 1987, a documentary film crew had attempted to investigate the legends surrounding Loch Droid Hecht. The filming had been halted when the crew's equipment began malfunctioning in inexplicable ways, and several crew members had reported feeling watched by an invisible presence. The documentary crew had been from the BBC and had been planning to create a program about Scottish folklore and legends. They had brought professional filming equipment and had planned to spend a week at the lake, but their cameras had repeatedly failed to function properly, and their sound equipment had picked up strange noises that couldn't be explained. The pattern of failed expeditions and mysterious incidents suggested that whatever had affected Professor Blackwood's team in 1905 was still present at the lake, still watching, and still dangerous to those who ventured too close. Dr. Mackenzie decided to research the current status of Loch Droid Hecht and whether it might be possible to organize a modern expedition to investigate the site using contemporary technology. Her inquiries led her to discover that the area around the lake had been designated as a protected nature reserve in 1995, with access strictly limited to authorized researchers. The designation had been made ostensibly to protect the area's unique ecosystem, but Dr. Mackenzie suspected that there might be other reasons for the restrictions. The nature reserve designation had been unusual in several respects. The area around Loch Droid Hecht didn't contain any particularly rare or endangered species, and the ecosystem wasn't significantly different from other highland areas that remained open to the public. The restrictions seemed disproportionate to the stated conservation goals. Dr. Mackenzie contacted the Scottish Natural Heritage Agency, to inquire about the possibility of obtaining permission to visit Loch Draoid Hecht for research purposes. The response she received was surprisingly evasive, with officials citing ongoing environmental studies and safety concerns as reasons why access to the lake was not currently possible. When Dr. Mackenzie pressed for more specific information about the nature of the safety concerns, she was told that the area was subject to unusual geological conditions that made it dangerous for visitors. No further details were provided, and her requests for additional information were politely but firmly declined. The official reluctance to discuss Loch Draoid Hecht suggested that modern authorities were aware of the lake's unusual properties and were taking steps to prevent public access to the site. Dr. Mackenzie decided to investigate whether there were any surviving descendants of the 1905 expedition members who might have knowledge of what had happened at the lake. Her research led her to Margaret Blackwood, Professor Alistair Blackwood's great-niece, who lived in Edinburgh and worked as a librarian at the National Library of Scotland. Margaret had inherited her great-uncle's personal papers and had spent years trying to understand what had happened to him during and after the Loch Draoid Hecht expedition. Margaret Blackwood was a woman in her 60s who had devoted much of her life to researching her family's history. She had been particularly interested in her great-uncle's work and had been troubled by the mysterious circumstances surrounding his final years. When Dr. Mackenzie contacted Margaret and showed her the enhanced photographs, the woman's reaction was immediate and emotional. "I've been waiting for someone to find those," Margaret said. "My great-uncle left behind journals and drawings that showed he had seen something at that lake, something that haunted him for the rest of his life. But no one believed him, and the university suppressed his accounts." Margaret revealed that Professor Blackwood had kept a private journal during the expedition, separate from the official records that had been filed with the university. This journal had been passed down through the family and contained detailed accounts of the strange experiences that the expedition had encountered at Loch Draoid Hecht. The private journal had been written in Professor Blackwood's own hand and had been carefully preserved by his family for over a century. Margaret had been reluctant to share its contents with researchers, fearing that they would dismiss her great-uncle's accounts as the ravings of a madman. According to the private journal, the expedition had begun normally, with the team successfully locating and documenting the stone carvings that had drawn them to the site. But on the third day of their stay, they had begun to notice unusual phenomena around the lake. The first sign that something was wrong had been the behavior of their equipment. Compasses had begun pointing in random directions, and their chronometers had started running at different speeds, making it impossible to keep accurate time. The team's cameras had also begun malfunctioning, with some photographs coming out completely black, while others showed strange distortions and anomalies. Professor Blackwood had initially attributed these problems to the remote location and the unusual mineral composition of the rocks around the lake. But as the phenomena continued and intensified, he had begun to suspect that something more significant was occurring. The journal described how the team had begun to see figures moving beneath the surface of the lake, shapes that appeared almost human, but moved in ways that defied the laws of physics. The figures seemed to be watching the expedition members, following their movements around the shoreline and appearing wherever the team set up their equipment. The underwater figures had been visible only under certain lighting conditions, appearing most clearly during the early morning and late evening hours when the sun was low on the horizon. The figures seemed to be aware of being observed and would disappear if anyone looked directly at them for too long. Most disturbing were Professor Blackwood's accounts of the reflections in the lake. He had noticed that the reflections didn't always match what was visible above the water's surface. Sometimes the reflections showed additional figures that weren't present in the real world, and sometimes the reflections of the expedition members themselves appeared distorted or wrong in subtle but unsettling ways. The journal described specific instances where Professor Blackwood had seen his own reflection in the lake, only to notice that the reflection was performing actions that he wasn't actually doing. The reflection would turn its head to look at things that weren't there, or would appear to be speaking when Professor Blackwood's mouth was closed. The journal's final entries described a growing sense of dread and paranoia among the expedition members. They had begun to feel constantly watched, and several team members had reported having vivid nightmares about being pulled beneath the lake's surface by elongated hands that reached up from the depths. The nightmares had been remarkably consistent among the expedition members, with all of them reporting similar visions of being dragged into the lake by pale, elongated beings with two large eyes. The dreams had been so vivid that several team members had awakened believing that they were actually drowning. The expedition had been abandoned on the 8th day when James Morrison, the photographer, had suffered what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. He had been found standing waist-deep in the lake, staring into the water and speaking to something that only he could see. When the other team members had pulled him from the water, he had been incoherent and terrified, claiming that they were coming for all of them. Morrison's breakdown had been the final straw for Professor Blackwood, who had decided that the expedition was too dangerous to continue. The team had packed their equipment and had left the lake immediately, despite not having completed their planned research. Margaret also showed Dr. Mackenzie a collection of drawings that Professor Blackwood had made after returning from the expedition. The drawings depicted the elongated humanoid figures that he claimed to have seen in the lake, with their two large eyes and distorted features. The drawings were remarkably similar to the face that Dr. Mackenzie had discovered in the photograph's reflection. "My great-uncle became obsessed with those drawings," Margaret explained. "He spent months creating them, trying to capture exactly what he had seen at the lake. He believed that the beings in the water were ancient entities that had been watching humanity for thousands of years." The drawings showed remarkable consistency and detail, suggesting that Professor Blackwood had been working from specific memories rather than general impressions. The beings were depicted as tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed to glow with an inner light. Their eyes were disproportionately large and completely black, giving them an alien appearance that was deeply unsettling. Professor Blackwood's drawings also included detailed reproductions of the stone carvings that the expedition had documented. But his versions of the carvings included additional symbols and figures that hadn't appeared in the official archaeological records, suggesting that he had seen details in the carvings that others had missed. The additional symbols in Professor Blackwood's drawings seemed to form a kind of written language or code that might have been used to communicate with the entities in the lake. The symbols were unlike any known ancient writing system, suggesting that they might represent a form of communication that was unique to the site. Dr. Mackenzie realized that Professor Blackwood's private accounts provided crucial context for understanding the anomalies in the expedition photographs. The face in the reflection wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger pattern of supernatural encounters that had occurred at Loch Droidheacht. Margaret also revealed that Professor Blackwood had attempted to organize a return expedition to the lake in the months before his death. He had believed that the beings in the water were trying to communicate with humanity, and that further study might reveal important information about ancient human history. But the university had refused to support a second expedition, and Professor Blackwood's colleagues had become increasingly concerned about his mental state. His obsession with the lake and its inhabitants had isolated him from the academic community and had ultimately led to his early death from what his physicians had described as nervous exhaustion. Professor Blackwood had spent his final months trying to decode the symbols he had observed in the stone carvings, believing that they contained important messages from the entities in the lake. He had filled dozens of notebooks with his attempts to translate the symbols, but he had died before making any significant breakthroughs. Dr. Mackenzie decided to examine Professor Blackwood's drawings more closely to see if they might provide additional clues about the nature of the entities that had been photographed at Loch Droidheacht. The drawings were remarkably detailed and consistent, showing the same elongated features and unsettling gaze that Dr. Mackenzie had observed in the photograph. But the drawings also included details that weren't visible in the photographic evidence, such as symbols or markings on the being's skin and suggestions of clothing or ornamentation that seemed to be made from aquatic materials. The beings in Professor Blackwood's drawings appeared to be wearing garments that looked like they were made from seaweed or other aquatic plants. The clothing seemed to move and flow as if it were still alive, suggesting that the entities had a close connection to their aquatic environment. Most intriguingly, some of the drawings showed the beings interacting with the stone carvings around the lake, suggesting that there might be a connection between the ancient artifacts and the supernatural entities that inhabited the water. The drawings depicted the entities touching specific symbols on the stone carvings, as if they were activating some kind of ancient mechanism or communication system. This suggested that the carvings might not simply be decorative, but might serve a functional purpose in facilitating contact between the entities and the human world. Professor Blackwood had also created detailed maps of the lake and the surrounding area, marking locations where he had observed unusual phenomena. These maps showed that the supernatural activity wasn't limited to the lake itself, but extended to several other sites in the surrounding highlands. The maps indicated specific locations where Professor Blackwood had observed the entities emerging from the water, areas where the stone carvings were most concentrated, and sites where the expedition's equipment had malfunctioned most severely. The pattern suggested that there was a network of supernatural activity throughout the region. Dr. Mackenzie decided to research these other locations to see if there might be additional evidence of the entities that Professor Blackwood had encountered. Her research revealed that several of the sites marked on Professor Blackwood's maps had their own histories of supernatural encounters and unexplained phenomena. Local folklore associated these locations with water spirits, ancient burial grounds, and other supernatural entities that were similar to the Sluag Uisge of Loch Draoid Hecht. The pattern suggested that the entities weren't confined to a single location, but were part of a larger supernatural ecosystem that existed throughout the Scottish Highlands. This finding had significant implications for understanding the nature and origin of the beings that had been photographed at the lake. One particularly interesting site was a smaller lake located about 10 miles from Loch Draoid Hecht, which local folklore claimed was connected to the larger lake by underground passages. Professor Blackwood had marked this location on his map as a site where he had observed similar entities, suggesting that there might be a network of underwater tunnels connecting multiple bodies of water in the region. Dr. Mackenzie also discovered that many of the sites marked on Professor Blackwood's maps contained stone carvings similar to those found at Loch Draoid Hecht. The carvings seemed to form a network of ancient markers that might have been created to warn people about the supernatural entities or to provide instructions for dealing with them. The distribution of the stone carvings suggested that the ancient peoples who had created them had been aware of the entities and had developed specific protocols for interacting with them safely. The carvings might represent a form of ancient knowledge that had been lost over time. Dr. Mackenzie decided to contact other researchers who had studied similar phenomena in other parts of the world to see if there might be parallels to what had been discovered at Loch Draoid Hecht. Her inquiries led her to Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher who had studied water spirits in traditional Japanese folklore, and Dr. Maria Santos, a Brazilian anthropologist who had investigated similar entities in Amazonian cultures. Dr. Tanaka was fascinated by the similarities between the Loch Draoid Hecht entities and the water spirits described in Japanese folklore. The kappa and other water spirits in Japanese tradition are often described as having elongated features and the ability to appear in reflections, she explained. They are said to be ancient beings that predate human civilization and that have been watching humanity from hidden realms. Dr. Tanaka had documented numerous cases of water spirits appearing in photographs and mirrors in Japan, particularly in areas where ancient shrines had been built near bodies of water. The entities seemed to be drawn to locations where humans had attempted to communicate with the spirit world. Dr. Santos had encountered similar entities in her research among indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin. Many Amazonian cultures have traditions about water spirits that can appear in reflections and that are associated with ancient knowledge and supernatural powers, she noted. These beings are often described as guardians of ancient sites and as entities that test or judge human beings who encounter them. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon had developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies for communicating with water spirits, many of which involved the use of reflective surfaces and specific types of offerings. Dr. Santos believed that these traditions might represent ancient knowledge about how to interact safely with supernatural entities. The cross-cultural similarities suggested that the entities photographed at Loch Draoid Hecht might be part of a global phenomenon involving ancient supernatural beings that had been observing humanity for thousands of years. Dr. Mackenzie decided to investigate whether modern technology might be able to detect the presence of these entities at Loch Droid Hecht or other similar sites. Her research led her to Dr. James Chen, a physicist who specialized in electromagnetic phenomena and who had developed sensitive equipment for detecting unusual energy patterns. Dr. Chen had previously worked with paranormal researchers to investigate allegedly haunted locations, and he was interested in applying his technology to the Loch Droid Hecht case. Dr. Chen explained that his equipment could detect electromagnetic anomalies that might indicate the presence of entities that existed in dimensions parallel to our own. If these beings exist in a realm that intersects with our physical world, they should create detectable disturbances in the electromagnetic field, he suggested. Dr. Chen's equipment was capable of detecting minute variations in electromagnetic fields, temperature, and other environmental factors that might indicate the presence of supernatural entities. His instruments were far more sensitive than conventional scientific equipment and could detect anomalies that would be invisible to normal observation methods. Dr. Mackenzie and Dr. Chen began planning an expedition to investigate Loch Droid Hecht using modern scientific equipment. However, their plans were complicated by the restricted access to the site and the apparent reluctance of authorities to allow researchers to visit the lake. Dr. Mackenzie decided to approach the Scottish government directly to request permission for a scientific expedition to Loch Droid Hecht. She prepared a detailed proposal outlining the historical significance of the site and the potential scientific value of investigating the anomalies that had been documented there. The proposal emphasized the importance of understanding the phenomena at Loch Droid Hecht from both historical and scientific perspectives. Dr. Mackenzie argued that the site represented a unique opportunity to study supernatural phenomena using modern scientific methods. The response to her proposal was surprising and disturbing. Instead of simply denying permission, government officials requested a meeting with Dr. Mackenzie to discuss her research and her interest in Loch Droid Hecht. The meeting took place at a government office in Edinburgh and included representatives from several agencies, including Scottish Natural Heritage, the Ministry of Defence, and what appeared to be intelligence services. The officials were polite, but clearly concerned about Dr. Mackenzie's research and its potential implications. During the meeting, Dr. Mackenzie learned that the government was well aware of the unusual properties of Loch Droid Hecht and had been monitoring the site for decades. The officials revealed that there had been several classified studies of the lake and that the restricted access was not primarily for environmental protection but for public safety. "There are phenomena at that location that we don't fully understand," one official explained. "Our studies have confirmed that there are unusual electromagnetic properties and other anomalies that could be dangerous to researchers who aren't properly prepared." The officials also revealed that there had been several modern incidents at the lake that had reinforced their decision to restrict access. In 1995, a team of military personnel conducting a routine survey of the area had reported encounters with unidentified entities that had emerged from the lake. The incident had been classified, but it had led to the immediate designation of the area as a restricted zone. The military encounter had involved a team of Royal Engineers who had been conducting a geological survey of the area as part of a routine mapping exercise. The team had reported seeing figures emerging from the lake that matched the descriptions in the historical accounts, and several soldiers had suffered psychological trauma from the encounter. More recently, satellite imagery had detected unusual activity around the lake, including unexplained lights and movements that suggested the presence of entities that weren't visible to conventional observation methods. The satellite data had shown patterns of activity that seemed to follow specific cycles, with increased activity occurring during certain phases of the moon and at particular times of the year. The patterns suggested that the entities might be following some kind of schedule or ritual that was connected to astronomical events. The government officials offered Dr. Mackenzie access to some of the classified research on Loch Droid Hecht in exchange for her cooperation in keeping her discoveries confidential. They explained that public knowledge of the lake's properties could lead to dangerous attempts by amateur investigators to visit the site. Dr. Mackenzie was torn between her scientific curiosity and her responsibility to protect public safety. After careful consideration, she agreed to review the classified materials and to work with the government to develop a safe approach to studying the phenomena at Loch Drowid Hecht. The classified research revealed that the government had been aware of the lake's unusual properties since the 1940s, when military personnel conducting training exercises in the area had reported encounters with unidentified entities. Subsequent studies had confirmed the presence of electromagnetic anomalies and other phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional science. The government studies had used sophisticated scientific equipment to monitor the lake and had documented numerous instances of anomalous activity. The research had confirmed that the entities were real and that they possessed capabilities that exceeded current scientific understanding. The research also revealed that the entities at Loch Drowid Hecht appeared to be highly intelligent and possibly telepathic. Several researchers who had attempted to study the lake had reported receiving mental communications from the entities, usually in the form of warnings to stay away from the water. The telepathic communications had been remarkably consistent across different researchers and time periods, suggesting that the entities had a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and communication methods. The messages typically conveyed a sense of ancient wisdom and a warning about the dangers of interfering with forces beyond human comprehension. Most disturbing was the discovery that the entities seemed to be capable of affecting electronic equipment and even human consciousness from a distance. Researchers who had spent extended periods near the lake had reported experiencing vivid dreams and visions that seemed to originate from an external source. The effects on human consciousness had been documented in detail, with researchers reporting shared dreams and visions that suggested the entities were capable of directly influencing human thoughts and perceptions. These effects had persisted even after researchers had left the area, suggesting that contact with the entities could have lasting psychological consequences. The government studies had also confirmed the connection between the lake and the ancient stone carvings in the area. Analysis of the carvings had revealed that they contained information about the entities and instructions for avoiding dangerous contact with them. The stone carvings had been studied by teams of linguists and archaeologists who had determined that they represented a form of written communication that was unlike any known ancient language. The symbols seemed to convey complex information about the entities and their relationship with the human world. Dr. Mackenzie realized that her discovery of the face in the 1905 photograph was just the beginning of a much larger mystery involving ancient entities that had been observing humanity for thousands of years. Working with government researchers, Dr. Mackenzie developed a protocol for safely studying the phenomena at Loch Drowid Hecht, using remote sensing technology and other methods that wouldn't require direct contact with the entities. The study revealed that the lake was indeed inhabited by entities that existed in a dimension parallel to our own, but that could interact with our physical world under certain conditions. The entities appeared to be ancient beings that had been present in the area for thousands of years and that had developed a complex relationship with human civilization. The research suggested that the entities were not malevolent, but were protective of their environment and wary of human interference. The tragedies that had befallen previous expeditions appeared to be the result of the entities' attempts to discourage human intrusion rather than deliberate attacks. The entities seemed to be following some kind of ancient protocol that governed their interactions with humans, possibly established thousands of years ago when the first stone carvings were created. The protocol appeared to be designed to protect both the entities and humans from the dangers of uncontrolled contact. Dr. Mackenzie's work on the Loch Drowid Hecht case established new protocols for investigating supernatural phenomena while maintaining public safety and scientific integrity. Her discoveries contributed to a growing understanding of the complex relationship between human civilization and the ancient entities that share our world. The 1905 photograph remained in the University of Edinburgh's restricted archives, but it was now accompanied by detailed documentation of the research that had revealed its secrets. The image served as a reminder that our world contains mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality, and that some knowledge comes with responsibilities that extend beyond simple scientific curiosity. Dr. Mackenzie continued her work in historical photographic analysis, but she never forgot the face in the reflection that had stared back at her across more than a century of time. The discovery had taught her that the past was never truly past, and that some images captured more than just moments in time. They captured glimpses of realities that existed beyond human understanding. The mystery of Loch Droid Hecht remained unsolved, but the research had established that the lake was home to entities that had been watching humanity for thousands of years. Whether these beings were guardians, observers, or something else entirely remained unknown, but their presence served as a reminder that our world contained wonders and terrors that lay just beyond the edge of human perception. The face in the 1905 reflection continued to watch from its place in the archives, a silent witness to the enduring mystery of Loch Droid Hecht and the ancient entities that called it home. And somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, beneath the still waters of a remote mountain lake, those same entities continued their eternal vigil, watching and waiting for reasons that only they understood. The research had revealed that the entities were part of an ancient network of supernatural beings that existed throughout the world, connected by purposes and knowledge that transcended human understanding. The 1905 photograph had provided a window into this hidden world, offering a glimpse of the watchers who had been observing humanity since the dawn of civilization. 2. Mackenzie's work had shown that some mysteries were meant to remain mysteries, and that the pursuit of knowledge must sometimes be balanced with wisdom and caution. The entities at Loch Droid Hecht had made it clear that they preferred to remain hidden, and perhaps that was for the best. The photograph from 1905 became a testament to the thin boundaries between our world and realms we barely comprehend. Professor Blackwood's expedition had stumbled upon something ancient and powerful, something that had been watching humanity from the depths of Highland lakes for millennia. In the years that followed Dr. Mackenzie's investigation, the restricted access to Loch Droid Hecht remained in place. The government continued its quiet monitoring of the site, documenting the ongoing presence of the entities while ensuring that the public remained unaware of their existence. Occasionally, hikers would report strange reflections in remote Highland lakes, or photographers would discover unexplained faces in their images, but these reports were quietly investigated and filed away, adding to the growing body of evidence that humanity shared its world with beings far older and more mysterious than most people could imagine. Dr. Mackenzie's enhanced photograph remained locked in the university archives, a reminder that some discoveries were too dangerous to share with the world. The face in the reflection continued to stare out from the image, its ancient eyes holding secrets that might never be fully understood. The entities of Loch Droid Hecht maintained their vigil, watching from their watery realm as humanity continued its journey through time. They had been there before the first humans arrived in Scotland, and they would likely remain long after the last human had departed. The mystery endured, as perhaps it was meant to. Some questions were not meant to be answered, and some watchers preferred to remain unseen. In the depths of a remote Highland lake, ancient eyes continued to observe, patient and eternal, guardians of secrets that transcended human understanding. The face in the 1905 reflection had revealed a truth that was both wonderful and terrifying. We are not alone, and we never have been. The watchers have always been there, just beyond the edge of perception, waiting in the spaces between worlds for reasons known only to themselves. And in the archives of the University of Edinburgh, the photograph continues to serve as proof that reality is far stranger and more complex than we dare to imagine.